Chapter 5 Invitation to Leave. The constable turned to the red-bearded man. Aren't you John Teason, the bishop's assistant? Teason nodded and frowned at Colin. I seem to remember this young thief. Where is his master? A new voice broke in. I'm his master. William Tyndale pushed his way through the crowd to Colin's side. Ah, yes, Sir William. John Teason smiled and bowed. I think heretics and thieves go well together. The venom in John Teason's voice made chills go down Colin's spine. William Tyndale put both hands on Colin's shoulders and faced John Teason. What is this all about? Colin is a good Christian boy, and I will be responsible for his actions. Colin squirmed with the mixed feelings of gratitude and humiliation. His breath quickened. He could not tell on Paul because Paul needed help. There was a mystery about his new friend, and Colin meant to find out more. I am willing to take the punishment, Colin said, bracing himself for more blows. I want to, he told William Tyndale. The crowd murmured in protest. No, no, that's enough. He's learned his lesson. The woman with the purse stepped forward. Yes, it's quite enough. John Teason glanced over the crowd and shrugged. I'm sure if the matter hasn't been taken care of properly, it will be. The threatening undercurrent of his words troubled Colin. As Cardinal Wolsey's spy, John Teason had threatened to pursue William Tyndale to the ends of the earth in order to prevent the translation of the Bible. The Bishop of London would undoubtedly agree with the Cardinal. Colin tried to put the troublesome thoughts out of his mind. The next day he came back to the cathedral. Paul sat on his heels in the same place under the stone arch. I hear you took a beating for me yesterday, and you didn't tell on me. Thanks. You're all right. Astonished, Colin asked, But how did you find that out? Paul threw back his head and laughed. It's plain you weren't born in London. You've got a lot to learn if you stay here. Watch this. Putting his two fingers in his mouth, Paul whistled, an odd little sound. Immediately the same whistle was echoed from a beggar near the entrance, then from an apple woman, a souvenir salesman, and a man holding horses. What does it all mean? Colin asked. Paul looked smug. The people I know all help each other, and me especially. It's really because of my father. He died saving a lot of people. Paul did not continue, but pointed out all his friends. They would have let you be really they wouldn't have let you be really hurt yesterday. They were all watching. I've got to get to work now. Colin soon saw that Paul worked hard running errands for rich people, often carrying important purchases for them. Why don't you steal those things? Colin asked. Paul was scornful. Because they trust me. People I know are particular about what they steal. It's only the people who put on airs that we fleece. After a while, Paul appeared tired and listless. He let his hooked stick slip to the pavement. The light left his eyes. Colin began to worry. When had the other boy eaten? Colin dare not ask because he sensed the other boy's pride. That evening he told Tyndale about Paul and was delighted at Tyndale's interest. The next day Tyndale talked to Paul while Colin browsed at a bookseller's stall. In a few minutes Tyndale came up. We're going with Paul to where he lives. He says there's someone sick down there. Paul had perked up, bright and alert. He sped light-footed through the crooked streets at a pace that left Colin breathless. Paul stopped at a run-down wharf. Half-open bales of cargo lay stacked in every direction. The odors of spoiled food and dead fish rose from the river. Here we are. They didn't use this anymore. Not after the ship sank. Paul pointed to a tunnel made of tumbled barrels. She's in there. William Tyndale's kind expression did not change. Colin tried to look as if he too were accustomed to a house made of boxes and barrels. Paul went ahead. I've got a friend with me, he called. He's a preacher, and he's going to help you get well. Inside the air was unbearably close. Colin could just make out the figure of Paul stooping to rearrange some rags around a woman lying in the corner. The woman murmured something. Colin could see a thin, lined face. The woman brushed back a few wisps of hair that had come loose under her tight bonnet. I'm Amy Blake, she said in a thick accent. Colin saw that she was too ill to speak above a hoarse whisper. I'm from Germany. Paul's father would be proud of him. The way he earns our keep. We don't owe a farthing to anybody. Now I'm going to die. What will become of Paul? She closed her eyes. Colin saw tears glisten below her lashes. Tyndale spoke to her in German. Mrs. Blake brightened at once. Two talked for several minutes. Finally, Tyndale rose to leave. We'll take you to our inn, he said in English. Mrs. Blake shook her head. I'll never leave here. It's my home. My husband brought me here from Germany. He drowned when the ship sank, but he saved 10 men, and they're all alive to this day. I'll never leave this place. Every day Tyndale brought food to Mrs. Blake, and Colin would come in later with Paul. The neighborhood learned of Mrs. Blake's illness, and soon women friends bustled in and out. We didn't know. We just didn't know she was ill, one explained. Mrs. Blake has so much pride, you know. But her husband saved mine from drowning, and neither I nor the others he saved will forget that. It was not long before the whole neighborhood knew William Tyndale. They talked of his comforting words, his prayers, and his help. Some declared that without William Tyndale's prayers, Mrs. Blake would have died. Collins saw the people's sympathy when Tyndale spoke of his plan to translate the Bible into English so that they could all read it. Everyone warned him of the penalty. We know the ways of the church. You're taking your life in your hands. More than one told him, but if you finish it, send it to us, and we'll see that it is distributed. William Tyndale smiled and thanked them, but Collins saw that he was just being courteous. Paul must have noticed that Tyndale was not really accepting the offer. One day, Paul's eyes danced with more mischief than usual. Sir William, we have ways of knowing about what's going to happen ahead of time. He and Colin took Tyndale to the cathedral. Now watch. Once again, Paul whistled his odd whistle. It was echoed from every corner. A grin of understanding crossed Tyndale's face. I believe you, he told Paul. That's quite a spy system. A few days later, Paul sent a message to Tyndale through Colin. Tell him he's going to get a summons to the bishop's palace. I just got word this morning. One of our people holds the bishop's horses, and he heard some people talking about it. Paul's prediction came true. At the inn, the message had been left with the innkeeper, who was almost bug-eyed with awe. Such fine liveries! The horses were all in gold, every inch of them, and they stopped in front of my inn. Oh, it has been a wonderful day. The neighborhood has never seen anything like it. Yes, yes, but where is the message? Tyndale asked. Oh, right here, Sir William, right here. You can be sure I kept it safely. The innkeeper babbled on, while Tyndale read and reread the paper. Paul was right. He told Colin, you can go with me. I'll take the Greek translation to show the bishop. He hummed to himself. Should I take anything else to show I'm capable of translating? No, he answered himself. All that in due time. The day of the appointment seemed long in coming. In the anteroom of the palace, the room was filled with petitioners. When an assistant ushered Tyndale and Colin through to the main chamber, a murmur of disappointment went through the crowd. Colin sensed that they were asking themselves and each other what favor Tyndale had with the bishop to be allowed to see him first. Colin trembled with awe at the sight of the richly robed bishop, who sat in an ornate chair before a long polished table. At first, Colin could only stare at the huge signet ring on the bishop's forefinger. When he dared to look at the bishop's stern, thoughtful face, Colin suddenly felt terrified and weak in the knees. Bishop Tunstall did not even glance at Colin. He waved away the letters of introduction William Tyndale pulled out. No, no, Tyndale, your recommendations are the highest, and your scholarship is impeccable. You seem to have quite a bit of influence among the people wherever you go. Such influence can be dangerous. Just what are you doing here in London? When Tyndale explained, Bishop Tunstall slumped back in his heavily carved chair and drummed his fingers on the arms. At last, Tyndale, my house is full. I have now more people than I can employ. Colin saw Tyndale's shoulders sag with disappointment. Besides, the bishop added, your preaching is stirring up the people. Do you think it wise to give them an appetite for something forbidden? Should a Bible in their own tongue be forbidden the people? Tyndale countered. A mottled crimson flowed the bishop's face. He drummed his fingers again and then placed the tips together. Look at that man Luther. His works are spreading like the plague. Today he calls for the abolition of the Mass. Tomorrow he will call for the abolition of Jesus Christ. Colin was not quite sure what the bishop meant, but he understood the hostile tone. Tyndale paced in front of the long table. The church has exalted its own honor above the king and above God himself. The church would rather put forth 1,000 books inscribed with false teaching than see that the scriptures come to light for the lay people. The bishop fingered his signet ring. Have you forgotten the Constitution of Arundel in 1408? Tyndale broke in hotly. It prohibited unauthorized versions of the scripture, but the king himself will be willing to authorize my version. What makes you so sure? Bishop Tunstall now toyed with a gold paperweight on the desk. Because God's authority is higher than the king's. Tyndale breathed fast as he said the words. Colin stiffened with dread. Would Tyndale begin to pound the bishop's table in his excitement? It is dangerous, very dangerous, to criticize existing conditions, the bishop murmured. The church service as we know it has been in existence hundreds of years. I think we can be sure it will continue to exist in Latin for hundreds of years in the future. He rang a tiny golden bell. At once the door opened and John Teeson entered. His red beard had never seemed more hateful to Colin. Teacher and ex-student stared at each other. Then Teeson ushered out Tyndale and Colin. No one spoke. Colin had never seen Tyndale so plunged in gloom all the way to the inn. The scene at the bishop's palace went through Colin's mind. He knew Tyndale, too, must have reviewed over and over what had taken place. At the inn, the innkeeper ran out to meet them. You have a visitor, a very important man. A businessman with fur lapels on his cloak hurried out with hands outstretched. So you're Sir William. I've been meaning to come to see you for several weeks. I'm Humphrey Monmouth, the merchant. Tyndale all but gasped the words. I've heard of you from my brother. He's a merchant here in town, but not as well known as you. I've been hearing your services. I go 3 miles just to listen to your sermons. Humphrey Monmouth said, You are the man of our times. I marvel that you can be such a scholar and yet be so direct and understandable. What are your plans for the future? Colin listened to Tyndale pour out the story of his many weeks of waiting, and how the Bishop of London had turned down Tyndale's request for a position in his palace. He refused? Humphrey Monmouth asked, his head cocked on one side. That's understandable. He has to stay on the right side of Cardinal Wolsey, and I have a feeling that the Cardinal would not approve of all you plan. But I want you to live at my house. I shall see to it that you need not to worry about earning a living. Your mission is of utmost importance to England. I shall be very proud to have you as my guest, and your page, too, of course. Humphrey Monmouth smiled down at Colin. Within a short time, Colin felt at home in Humphrey Monmouth's well-furnished house. William Tyndale chose an attic room for his study and worked on his translations for many hours a day. In the mornings, Colin studied the lessons Tyndale assigned him and spent the afternoons with Paul at the cathedral. He had persuaded Paul to teach him German, but Colin had a plan other than fleecing people with the language. Someday Tyndale might want to visit Martin Luther in Germany, and Colin wanted to understand what the two men would say, but it was a secret desire. He did not even tell Paul. One day Colin came to the cathedral to find Paul, but his friend was not in sight. A few minutes later Paul ran up, his face pinched with worry. I just found out something terrible. Hurry and tell Sir William. Paul grabbed Colin's arm and shook it. Tell him what? Paul gasped out the words. They're going to set Humphrey Monmouth's house on fire and burn up all those manuscripts. And they hope Sir William will be burned too. Paul pranced in agony. Go tell him. I'll see if I can find out any more. Paul disappeared. Colin darted through the streets, a lump of fear rising in his throat. Long before he reached the house, he saw a billow of smoke. Fire, the dread of every person in London, mounted in a column from the ground floor of Humphrey Monmouth's house and licked to the attic room where William Tyndale sat translating the Bible. Colin well knew Tyndale would be so busy he would not even notice the flames until too late. Even as he thought, Colin saw the white smoke part and a shaft of cruel red flame dart upwards.